important diplomatic role that the Pope played, Paul VI, but it's one that most people don't know. So he was responsible for getting the United States and the Vietnamese together. Now, it didn't happen until 1973 when the war finally ended, but it was Paul that got them talking to each other. It was his intervention that brought them together.
You're watching the Spotlight Network, starring Hollywood's newsman, Logan Crawford.
They now believe a single member.
He works with TV and film legends. And now, Logan's shining the spotlight on the world's top emerging authors and creators.
International were abducted.
This is Spotlight with Logan Crawford, streaming on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV.
I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're exploring a powerful book. It is called Pope Paul VI and His Quest for Peace, 1963 to 1978, Volume 2. It's written by a terrific author by the name of Reverend John F. Tuohey, PhD. This compelling work revisits the papacy of the Pope, a leader who made world peace his mission during one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. With sharp historical insight, Dr. Tuohey shows how the Pope redefined the role of the Church, challenging nations to replace war with justice and human rights and reconciliation as well. We are delighted to have this talented author join us here today on Spotlight, and we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. Father, thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. When I was a little kid growing up in the 1960s, my mom was upset because no longer was the Mass said in Latin, and the Pope was and the priest was now facing the congregation instead of having his back to us while saying Mass. That was the effect of the Second Vatican Council. And as we look back now, and she grew to like the changes as well eventually. Change is always tough within the church. The Pope made some dramatic changes in the church. Chief among them were implementing the Vatican Council's changes, correct?
Yes. In fact, he was Cardinal Archbishop in Milan when his predecessor, John the 23rd, caught everyone off guard, including him, and they were very good friends, that he was going to call this council. And the future Pope Paul VI, his comment was, "The old man has no idea the hornet's nest he is opening up." And then, of course, it fell on Paul VI to deal with the hornets. So, yes, very much so, very much so.
Exactly. Like I said, my mom was one of those hornets at first, but we learned to embrace the changes. You refer to Pope Paul VI as the forgotten Pope. Why is that?
Well, I think one of the reasons is the one that most people refer to is when John the 23rd, his immediate predecessor, he opened up, the expression is he opened up the windows, and he was very dynamic, a very big change from what preceded him with Pius XI and Pius XII. And then, of course, he was followed by the very young and dynamic John Paul II, who reigned as Pope for much longer. So he was kind of trapped between a very popular change and a very popular one who followed. And he did all the heavy lifting. John the 23rd called for the council, but Paul was the one that had to run it. They had to convince John to add a second session so that they could engage the world. And then, of course, Paul VI added 2 more on top of that. So we had 4 sessions. So I think he's forgotten in part because it was a very turbulent time and people just wanted to move on. He kind of disappeared from view. He was in poor health for the last several years. 1975, he called for a holy year. That was really his swan song, if you will, and then kind of faded from view. So his dynamism was in the early part of his papacy and then kind of drifted. And so and it's interesting that Benedict XV, who was Pope during World War I, he's also referred to as the forgotten Pope. So it seems that popes who really took on peace as a project for their papacies, for some reason, they tend to drift from view. I'm not sure any more than that.
Certainly much needed during the Vietnam War. The Pope's voice was much needed. It certainly was an unpopular war, particularly towards the waning years of the war,
Right.
correct?
Yes, and in fact, in some ways, you mentioned the changes in the church. In some ways, Paul, especially in 1965, when he came to the United Nations, the first pope to do so, he kind of had a PR challenge because the episcopacy in the United States, especially Cardinal Spellman in New York, they were adamantly in favor of military action in Southeast Asia. And so he was rather prophetic, and he was the only one, he was the Pope, but he was the only one out there saying, no, no, no. And then people got distracted. All of a sudden, the priest is facing the people. All of a sudden, it's in the same language as in all the countries of the world. And I think in some ways, people got distracted by the obvious changes of the council. And it took a while for his peace messages to really begin to sink in.
Absolutely. His papacy was different than Pope John. I don't remember Pope John, but again, from talking with my mother, he seemed to be a very popular pope, perhaps a more warm and fuzzy pope, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And Paul was very much a contemplative. He very much thrived on private prayer, and being amongst the people really drained him. He spent his time out there. But yes, John the 23rd was much more to use your expression, warm and fuzzy pope. Paul was much more the academic. Although, if you read his works, his speech to the United Nations, we're coming up on the 60th anniversary of that. And if you read his peace messages, which is really volume 2 of the commentary, he was just an incredible writer and speaker. And he was also brief and concise. His nephew quoted him as saying that Paul VI thought a 5-minute homily was for the soul, a 10-minute homily was for the preacher, and a 15-minute homily was for the devil. So Paul was very academic, but very concise and very wonderful language. And you really appreciate him more in his writings than actually in his persona.
It's funny. I like that about the lengths of the sermons and the homilies. We actually had a parish priest who could get the whole mass done in 30 minutes. Well, we used to try to get to that mass.
Oh, well, yeah. I can't say I can do that. I'm a 7-minute man myself.
He was quick. He was a fast speaker. I can't even remember his name. He did 5 o'clock mass on Sundays, and we were out by 5:30. But those were great times. What impact did Vatican Council II have on Paul's pursuit of peace? Did that impact it?
Absolutely. He and Congress from Belgium were really the leaders in getting John to extend the council in order to embrace the world, which is really the very last document from the council, Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution and the work in the church in the modern world. And that really became a vehicle for Paul. He went to the United Nations and congratulated them on their 20th anniversary, challenged them to move forward. And his great words, which is the subtitle for volume 1, Never Again War. And he didn't mention some of the issues that later he ushered through the Vatican Council. Foremost amongst them, I would say, was conscientious objection. Pius XII, who was Pope through World War II, rather, and into the 50s, he made it very clear, and I quote him in my book, volume 1, a Catholic simply cannot refuse military service to his country. Absolutely no, can't do it. He even said it in a Christmas message. And then John the 23rd said, well, government should appeal to people's conscience. And Paul picked up on that and ushered through the Second Vatican Council the recognition that if we're going to ever have world peace, one of the pathways to peace is allowing people to say no to war. And so the Second Vatican Council, through his leadership, asserted that governments need to allow people to object in conscience to war and not serve. They have to do something to serve the common good, but they can work in farms, especially when farmers are going off to fight. We need people to grow food and different things like that. The other one is his rejection of nuclear weapons. And it's interesting because the United States bishops don't really address that issue until Paul II in the 1980s, Where already Paul in the 1960s, he's saying not only is their use immoral, but their very possession is immoral, because he said they cause nightmares and they ruin people's lives out of fear. And so those were the big issues that he really brought through the council. He didn't mention them in many of his speeches, but certainly through the council. Conscientious objection. People have to be able to say, no, I will not go. And also the rejection of nuclear weapons, even their possession. And that was really, again, 20 years before the rest of the world started to get on board and say, you know what, it's not just their use, it's their very possession that's morally problematic. So the council was very useful for him in getting further his message across about never again war. That can't happen unless we do these other things.
Conscientious objection recognized by the government when it comes to Catholics? I don't think so, right? It was only perhaps Mormons or something?
Well, yes, it is actually.
Oh, it is?
That was actually during the Vietnam War. Many Catholics moved to Canada because they wouldn't fight. And the government did not recognize the teaching of the Catholic Church, that they couldn't claim their faith. The government said, well, no, your church says you have to go. They were still locked into Pius XII. So it took time for that teaching to be integrated and to be accepted by the government. But in fact, yes, a Catholic can say today no. And the government will recognize that as following the teachings of their faith community.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hopefully there's never a draft. Hopefully there's never another war. You addressed the Pope's address before the United Nations in 1965 a little earlier, but it truly was unprecedented. Tell us why he took that step and the impact of it all.
Right. Well, he had dedicated his papacy to the pursuit of world peace. He made that clear even before he was, well, you become Pope immediately upon election, but even before he was, they used to crown popes. He was the last one to be crowned. He stopped all that. And he felt the United Nations was the world stage on which the church could best speak. And so he made it clear to the Secretary General Youthant in 1964, when he went to the Vatican, that he wanted to address the United Nations. It was kind of he initiated the whole idea, some scholars say. So Youthant did invite him on the occasion of the 20th anniversary. So he had already been to the Middle East in 1964 and had gone to India in 1964. So his traveling the world had already begun. And he was invited to come. He chose October 4th, which is the memorial for St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of peace. And he wanted to go to give his moral recognition of the United Nations. And that was unprecedented as well, for the Pope to recognize a secular institution as having moral authority and a moral place in the world. He really put all his marbles in that basket at the UN. That this was the institution. He wanted to make that clear. In fact, he ends his speech by saying, the world looks to you to be the architects of peace. And when you leave this room, know that the world is depending on you. So he really wanted to emphasize to the UN, the delegates, it's up to you, folks. You need to lead the way to peace. And the highlight of his speech, and he mentions, now I've come to the culmination, the moment you're all waiting for. And he says, never again, one against the other, never again, war. And that was really the message he wanted to put out for them. He makes the comment, there's no need for me to give a long talk about why your work is so important. We need only look at human history. And so it was very important to him to speak on the world stage and to emphasize to the UN, the church is with you. We recognize the importance of your role, and we will work with you. And in fact, he instituted the Commission for Peace and Justice, which was an experiment in the church. It works with secular institutions for peace and justice, primarily with the United Nations as well. So that was really the point of his message. The church has something to say. We want to say it to you, and you have a task to do, and that's to work for world peace. And it's all up to you, folks. And that was really why he went, to really, the church is behind you, and we will work with you, but you are the ones that have to do the lifting.
How did world leaders react to his challenge, never again war?
Well, and you can watch this actually on YouTube when he comes to the end of his speech. Um, he said, when you leave the room, you're the architect. And he finishes and he says, thank you. He spoke in French. And there's dead silence in the hall I believe there were 116, 117 delegates, foreign ministers, and the audience. And there's just dead silence. And the comment is made that it was as if the message had to sink in. And he left the podium in silence. And then the audience erupted with a standing ovation. And to this day, it is described as the most enthusiastic response of a world leader to the United Nations back in 1965, 60 years ago. So they were stunned and then responded with great enthusiasm for his message.
Amazing, amazing. And it should be received like that because it is a powerful message. And I would think a universal message. Who wants war? Obviously, some do. That's why we have at least two wars raging right now. But I think
Right,
most
right.
normal people, average people, the people who do the living and dying and the fighting in those wars don't want them. Talk to us a little bit about his annual New Year's peace messages. They help shape global discussions, as I understand it, on justice and human rights.
Right. He decided sometime in 1967 that he would initiate this papal genre. It had never been done before. And so he started it in 1968, rather interestingly, because he had just had a run-in with Lyndon Johnson at the Vatican over Vietnam. And of course, the president had no idea that within a week, the Pope was going to start these annual messages. He says in his 1968 message, the very first one, that he wants to give an exact idea of peace. And that's really the point of each one. He plays on the formula with which we use very often today. If you want peace, and he rejects that. He rejects the idea that war is the absence of peace, but rather peace is something, and it's war that's the absence. So he wants to give these exact ideas. So he'll say things like, if you want peace, work for justice. That's the most well-known one, 1972. If you want peace, reconcile with one another. And so that was really the idea, to have these annual, let's stop, let's think about what peace is, and to give these exact ideas, and really to take on contemporary thought and replace it with a more positive attitude. So if you want peace, defend life. If you want peace, his second one, if you want peace, promote human rights. So he really takes peace is something. It's justice, it's human rights, it's reconciliation, it's development. In 1967, his encyclical, he says, development is the new word for peace. So he wants to use these annual messages. Peace is something. It's not the absence of fighting. It's the presence of positive attitudes towards humanity. And so he spends it. He mentions in his first one, he doesn't want to be caught off guard by God for having been silent on peace. And so that's really what these 11 messages do. He doesn't want to get caught off guard. He wants to be able to say to St. Peter at the pearly gates, this is what peace is. This is the message I brought in fulfillment of his role as Pope. And as I say, he's a beautiful writer. His father inherited his father's writing talent. They're brief, they're concise, they're prophetic in parts, and well worth the read.
Absolutely. And like you said, you can even watch it on YouTube. And I think that's an amazing aspect of our digital age, and well worth the watch, no doubt.
Yes,
Do you see his
yes.
papacy as a turning point in how the Vatican engages with world politics?
Well, in some ways, John the 23rd started it, but one of his great disappointments was he was not able to visit Poland. He really wanted to, like his predecessor, reach out to the communist Black nations to help bring about reconciliation, which of course, John Paul II brought that even greater lengths and was instrumental in bringing about the end of the Cold War. So, yes, there was a new direction in not being afraid of the communists, but reaching out to them. So, certainly, um, while John the 23rd laid the groundwork, it was really Paul that did the reaching out. So, that very much influenced church dynamics. One thing that he did that has not really taken hold, popes have always tried to be neutral. And so they do things like today call for a ceasefire. That was not Paul's way. Paul got himself in a bit of a problem with Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State for Lyndon Johnson. Dean Rusk described him as his balance was uneven in his neutrality. Paul didn't call for ceasefires. He said bombing is immoral. Stop doing it. So, and now we've gone back to, well, let's have ceasefires, let's have ceasefires. Paul was not afraid to call out what he thought was wrong. And so he was, in a sense, not really neutral. He opposed the United States being there in the first place. He opposed the bombing, whereas popes generally try to not get anybody upset on one side or the other. That was not Paul's way. He called it the way he saw it. If it's wrong, he said so.
Which seems to be the way it should be. You know, I understand
Yes.
politically be neutral, but Jesus wasn't neutral. Jesus
Right. I would agree
overturned the
with you. Yes,
tables
absolutely.
of the money changers,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah. You know, he spoke his mind. And
Right.
that's what it takes to, you know, enact change and foster peace. How did the Pope's relationship with President Johnson influence peace negotiations in Vietnam?
Oh, that's a fascinating story. Um, what happened was, so Lyndon Johnson went to Australia for a funeral, a state funeral, and then went to Vietnam and Thailand. And then on the way back, decided to visit Pakistan. And he left Pakistan. So this is December 23rd. And they take off from Pakistan, and he goes to the pilot and says, "We're going to Rome, and don't tell a GD soul until we get there." He landed in Rome, notified the Vatican, the president is coming to see the Pope. And he got in his helicopter. Now, just how unprecedented this is, he was unannounced, he was not invited, and no helicopter had ever landed in the Vatican Gardens. They didn't have coordinates. And so the pilot of the helicopter had to use an aerial postcard to find a place to land. So this is December 23rd. And he went, the New York Times said, to set the Pope straight on Vietnam. He had just started a bombing campaign. So Paul was not thrilled. And his dropping in on him angered the Pope, but he agreed to meet with him. And during the meeting, it is recorded that he yelled at Lyndon Johnson, and to emphasize his point, banged the desk in their private office, you know, like you would slap to emphasize, and yelled at the president that this was wrong and it had to stop. And the president left. That was December. In March, Johnson did what Paul wanted. He stopped the bombing, and he wrote to Paul. He went through the delegate in Washington, and he asked Paul to reach out to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and invite them to the Vatican to begin talking about negotiations. And because the president trusted Paul, he said, "Do it however you want to do it, but invite them and see if you can get them to come, because obviously I can't. They won't answer me." And so Paul did, and within 24 hours, the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese said, "You know what? Let's skip the Vatican. We'll meet them in Paris on May 10th, and 1968." And so really it was Paul's reaching out to the North and saying, the president wants to talk. And they said, okay. And so the president couldn't get them to come and speak to him in the United States, but Paul was able to. And that's really the official biography by Hebblethwaite calls that the most important diplomatic role that the Pope played, Paul VI, but it's one that most people don't know. So he was responsible for getting the United States and the Vietnamese together. Now, it didn't happen until 1973 when the war finally ended, but it was Paul that got them talking to each other. It was his intervention. that brought them together. And it was because Johnson trusted him. And I think because Paul, he had the audacity to just drop in on the Pope, and the Pope had the audacity to yell at him. So it all worked out. It all worked out.
He wasn't going to be a pushover. He wasn't going to be
not, no.
neutral. He was going to speak his mind, even if it meant banging his hand on the table. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of the Pope that we will learn about by exploring your book. What do you hope readers take away from the life of Pope Paul VI after reading your book?
Whoa. Well, I hope what they'll take away is his insistence that peace is the presence of something. It was very important for him to change the way people think about peace. We're not going to have peace by having mutual assured destruction. Deterrence isn't the way to peace, that we have to put things in place. If we want peace, and Lyndon Johnson agreed with him on this, that there will never be world peace unless we lift up developing nations. So I hope what they take away from it is that the way to peace has nothing to do with armament. The way to peace, if we will develop the developing countries, if we will deal with poverty in our own nation, if we will deal with food insecurity in our own nation, that's the way to peace, and start to shift our priorities. One of the things he said in India, what he didn't call on developing nations to put more money into developing the developing nations. He called for them to take money out of their defense budgets and put it to that. It was his way of turning swords into plowshares. So to really not just do more good things, but to take away from the armaments and put that toward doing good things. And I hope that's what people will take away from it, that we're not going to get peace by building weapons. We're only going to get peace by human rights, working for justice, becoming friends with each other, and taking that, really wanting peace, not just wanting peace and quiet, but wanting justice, human rights, and so forth, development and so forth. That's what I hope they take away. It's a lot of work, and he says that peace is a lot of work.
Yeah, but that blueprint that he laid out addresses so many ills of society. We have an exploding prison population. If people were better educated, that wouldn't be the case. We have such rampant violence in this country. Again, if people were shown more of Christ's love, I don't think that would be the case. I think if we were directing our resources, and I'm not a liberal, but I do believe in empowering people, and I guess part of me can't help but be liberal when it comes to educating people, feeding people, housing people, and preventing wars. I think those actually shouldn't be liberal values or conservative values. I think they should be universal values.
Right. Human values, human rights.
Human values.
Right.
Exactly. And, a popular expression that sprung up during the 90s was, what would Jesus do? Right. And I think the answer to most of that is clear. Wonderful work on this book, Father. You really shed light on an important figure, not only in the Catholic Church, but in world history that few people don't know very much about, including myself. I was enlightened by this book, enlightened by our conversation today. The name of the book is, absolutely, the name of the book is Pope Paul VI and His Quest for Peace, 1963 to 1978, Volume 2, If You Want Peace. It is a work that brings to light the lasting legacy of a pope devoted to peace. Father, thank you so much for joining us here today.
It was a privilege. Thank you very much for inviting me.
The privilege is all mine. I appreciate your wonderful insight on this wonderful world leader and this terrific leader of the Catholic Church. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time, on Spotlight.